They preached salvation, but found themselves condemned. From pastors turned hitmen to clerics accused of masterminding mass murder, these are men who once claimed the mantle of God only to end up on death row. In this episode, we uncover the shocking double lives of preachers, prophets, and spiritual leaders whose paths led not to the pulpit, but to the death chambers. Brace yourself. These stories will challenge everything you thought you knew about faith, morality, and justice. If you value true crime stories delivered with depth, accuracy, and respect, subscribe to our channel and enable notifications so you don't miss a detailed deep dive like this. Now let's kick off with our first case. Number 10. Paul Jennings Hill, the pastor who chose the gun over the pulpit. On a warm summer morning in Pensacola, Florida, the parking lot outside the Ladies' Center, abortion clinic was quiet until the crack of a shotgun shattered the air. Two people fell instantly. Dr. John Britton, a physician who performed abortions, and his volunteer bodyguard, James Barrett. Barrett's wife, June, was injured but survived. The shooter didn't run. He placed his weapon on the ground, knelt, and waited for police. His name was Paul Jennings Hill, a former Presbyterian minister who claimed God had commanded him to act. Born February 6, 1954, in Miami, Florida, Hill's early life seemed far from violent. After high school, he joined the U.S. Marine Corps, serving from 1972 to 1975. Discipline, order, and a sense of mission defined his young adulthood. After the military, he enrolled at Reformed Theological Seminary in Jackson, Mississippi, where he trained to become a pastor. Friends described him as intelligent, deeply religious, and outspoken about moral issues, particularly abortion, which he saw as the greatest moral evil of modern times. By the mid-1980s, Hill was ordained in the Presbyterian Church in America and served as a pastor in Pensacola. But behind his sermons, his beliefs about abortion were becoming more radical, moving from theological debate to calls for direct action. In the late 1980s and early 1990s, the United States saw a wave of anti-abortion protests. Hill joined the movement, but his rhetoric grew more extreme than most. He began writing and speaking about the idea that killing abortion providers could be justifiable homicide, a term that shocked even many in the anti-abortion movement. In 1993, when Michael Griffin shot and killed Dr. David Gunn, Hill publicly defended the killing in interviews. This stance got him defrocked by his denomination and distanced from mainstream pro-life leaders. But Hill saw it as confirmation that he was doing God's work. To him, abortion was mass murder, and those who performed it were akin to executioners. If the law wouldn't stop them, he believed God had given him the duty to act. Hill spent the days leading up to the attack carefully planning his actions. Armed with a 12-gauge shotgun, he arrived at the Ladies' Center abortion clinic early on the morning of July 29th. Dr. Britton had been performing abortions for years and was under regular threat from extremists. James Barrett, a retired Air Force lieutenant colonel, often volunteered to escort him for protection. As they exited their vehicle, Hill raised his shotgun and fired. Britton and Barrett died instantly. Barrett's wife was shot in the arm as she tried to shield herself. Witnesses were horrified, but Hill appeared calm, almost relieved. When police arrived, he told them plainly, "I've just shot and killed them." Hill's trial became a media spectacle. From the start, he admitted the killings, framing them as justifiable defensive action to protect unborn children. He refused a plea deal that would have spared him the death penalty. Prosecutors argued that Hill's act was premeditated murder. His public statements and prior writings left no doubt that the attack was intentional. In November 1994, he was convicted of 2 counts of first-degree murder and 1 count of attempted murder. During sentencing, Hill told the court he had no regrets. "I am more than willing to die for what I did. I believe with all my heart that it was God's will." Hill was sent to Florida State Prison, where he continued to defend his actions in letters, interviews, and even on the internet through supporters. He saw himself as a martyr, a soldier in a holy war against abortion. His presence on death row became a rallying point for a small but vocal group of extremists who praised him as a hero. For the rest of America, however, he was a chilling example of how religious conviction could be twisted into deadly violence. On September 3, 2003, after 9 years on death row, Paul Jennings Hill was executed by lethal injection. He was the first person in the United States to be executed for killing an abortion provider. Hill remained unrepentant to the end. His final statement, spoken without hesitation, was, "If you believe abortion is a lethal force, you should oppose the force and do what you have to do to stop it." To his supporters, Hill died a martyr. To his critics, he was a murderer who betrayed the very faith he claimed to uphold. His case reignited debates over religious extremism, free speech, and domestic terrorism in America. In the years since his execution, Hill's actions have been cited in both anti-abortion violence prevention programs and radical propaganda. His story stands as a stark warning. When moral conviction becomes absolute and unyielding, it can turn the pulpit into a weapon and a man of God into a killer. Number 9. Tony Alamo, the cult evangelist who abused his followers. They called him a preacher. He called himself a prophet. But what he really was a predator. This is the twisted story of Tony Alamo, an evangelist who built an empire on fire and brimstone sermons, flashy media appearances, and denim jackets, all while hiding a terrifying secret behind church walls. Tony Alamo was born as Bernie Lazar Hoffman in 1947 in Joplin, Missouri. He changed his name to Tony Alamo in the 1960s, supposedly to sound more Italian and showbiz-friendly. Why? Because before he claimed God, he chased fame. He moved to Hollywood, chasing a music career. He never made it big, but he did meet a woman who would change his life forever, Edith Opal Horn, who also went by Susan Alamo. Together, they reinvented themselves, not as musicians but as ministers. In 1969, they founded the Tony and Susan Alamo Christian Foundation. Their message? A loud, apocalyptic brand of Christianity with a cult-like obsession with sin, salvation, and the second coming. At first, they were just two loud voices on the streets of Hollywood, preaching repentance. But soon, followers started to gather, runaways, addicts, the homeless, lost souls looking for direction. Alamo offered them food, shelter, and salvation, but only if they followed his every command. By the late 1970s, the Alamo ministry had built a compound in Alma, Arkansas, complete with housing, a church, a printing press, and even a TV and radio studio. They pushed out thousands of pieces of propaganda every year. The community worked 16-hour days without pay. They handed over their belongings. Women were expected to submit. And any form of disobedience was considered rebellion against God. Then in 1982, Susan Alamo died. But Tony said she hadn't left. He claimed God would resurrect her. For 6 months, her body was kept on display inside a glass coffin at the compound. Her resurrection never came. But Tony didn't fall apart. He doubled down. Tony Alamo's teachings became darker, more controlling. He claimed God allowed men to have multiple wives. Soon after, girls in the church, some as young as 9 years old, were forced into marriages with him. Many of them were told it was their divine duty. Some were physically punished if they refused. Parents were brainwashed or silenced. Those who tried to escape were hunted down or shunned. Behind the fire and brimstone sermons was a man living in luxury, surrounded by underage girls and unquestioned authority. He preached against sin but committed unspeakable acts in private. And yet for years, he avoided serious legal consequences. Whispers started to reach the outside world. Former members fled and began talking. Lawsuits were filed. Investigators from Arkansas, California, and Tennessee began quietly building their case. But Alamo was slippery. He relocated. He used religion as a shield. He even accused the government of trying to silence him for preaching the truth. It wasn't until 2008 that everything came crashing down. That September, FBI agents and Arkansas State Police raided the Alamo compound in Fouke, Arkansas. Dozens of children were removed. Hidden rooms were discovered. And the stories that poured out were horrifying. Girls, some as young as 8, had been sexually abused, married off, and brainwashed. Some were sent across state lines under the guise of ministry work, but were really being trafficked. In 2009, Tony Alamo stood trial in Texarkana, Arkansas, on 10 counts of transporting minors across state lines for illegal sexual activity. The testimonies were chilling. One by one, 5 brave women told the court how Tony had taken their innocence. How he told them that God ordained their abuse. How they were isolated, manipulated, and beaten into silence. He showed no remorse. In fact, he insisted he was being persecuted for preaching the gospel. But the jury saw the truth. Verdict: guilty on all 10 counts. Sentence: 175 years in federal prison. The judge said it was effectively a life sentence, and that he deserved every second of it. After the conviction, the government seized many of Alamo's properties. Survivors began rebuilding their lives. Several filed civil lawsuits and were awarded millions in damages. In May 2017, Tony Alamo died in federal custody. He was 82 years old. He never apologized, never admitted guilt. He went to his grave insisting he was a victim. But those he hurt finally had their voices heard. Number 8. Abu Bakar Basir, the cleric in the crosshairs. On the streets of Solo, Central Java, the call to prayer echoed from a modest mosque. Inside, an elderly man in a white robe and turban sat cross-legged, reciting verses from the Quran. His voice was calm, measured, almost gentle. Yet this same man's name would be tied to one of the most devastating terrorist attacks in Southeast Asia. His name was Abu Bakar Ba'asyir, a Muslim cleric whose fiery sermons, relentless activism, and alleged ties to Jemaah Islamiyah Jia placed him in the crosshairs of governments from Jakarta to Washington. Born August 17, 1938 in Jombang, East Java, Basir grew up in a devout Muslim family. His path seemed destined for a religious service. He studied at Gontor Islamic Boarding School, later earning a degree from Al-Irsyad University. By the 1970s, he was co-founding Al-Mukmin Islamic Boarding School in Angruki, a place that would later gain notoriety as a breeding ground for radical Islamists. At first, his teachings focused on morality and discipline. But as Indonesia's political climate shifted, so did his rhetoric. The 1980s were a time of tension under President Suharto's authoritarian rule. Islamic political movements were suppressed, and Basir's public defiance led to repeated arrests. His refusal to pledge loyalty to the secular state only solidified his image among followers as a man of unshakable faith. In 1985, facing charges under Indonesia's anti-subversion laws, Basir fled to Malaysia, where he lived in exile for over a decade. During that time, he allegedly forged ties with militant networks, including the emerging group Jemaah Islamiyah, an organization later accused of orchestrating deadly attacks across Southeast Asia. When Suharto fell in 1998, Basir returned to Indonesia. Reformasi, reform era, politics allowed greater freedom of speech, and he wasted no time reclaiming his pulpit. His sermons blended religious revival with political resistance, warning against Western influence and calling for an Islamic state governed by Sharia law. Within days, Indonesian police and intelligence agencies linked the attacks to Jemaah Islamiyah. Investigations revealed that some of the convicted bombers, including Amrozi, Mukhlis, and Imam Samudra, had studied at Basir's Al-Mukmin school or were influenced by his teachings. While Basir denied direct involvement, prosecutors accused him of being the spiritual leader of G and giving ideological support to those who carried out the attacks. Basir was arrested in 2003 and charged with treason and terrorism. His first conviction in 2005 was for conspiracy in the Bali bombings, though his sentence was reduced on appeal. The case was controversial. Supporters claimed it was politically motivated, while critics argued that evidence of his influence was undeniable. In 2010, at the age of 72, Basir was arrested again, this time accused of helping fund and organize a militant training camp in Aceh. In 2011, he was sentenced to 15 years in prison for terrorism-related charges. Basir remained a preacher, even in prison. Guards reported that he led prayers, taught Quran study sessions, and continued to advocate for the creation of an Islamic caliphate. His refusal to sign loyalty pledges to the Indonesian state kept him under strict monitoring. At one point, he faced the possibility of a death sentence if linked more directly to the Bali attack or other plots. Though he avoided execution, several of his closest associates and students were sentenced to death and executed. To his followers, Basir was a victim of Western-backed oppression, a man punished for speaking the truth. To his critics, he was the ideological engine behind mass killings and radical recruitment in Indonesia and beyond. The Indonesian government has walked a careful line imprisoning him to weaken his influence, but avoiding making him a martyr. His presence has continued to inspire radical cells, both in Indonesia and in neighboring countries. In 2021, at the age of 82, Basir was released from prison early for health reasons and good behavior. His return home to Central Java drew both cheers and condemnation. He remained under tight surveillance, and authorities banned him from delivering public sermons that could incite radicalism. Abu Bakar Basir's story is a reminder of how religious authority can be weaponized. He never planted a bomb, never fired a gun, yet his words, teachings, and networks inspired those who did. He occupies a complex place in modern history, a frail old cleric to some, a dangerous mastermind to others. In the end, his life is a cautionary tale of how ideology, when left unchecked, can spill over from the pulpit into violence on the streets. Number 7. Charles Chideth Ng, the killer who found God in a cell. In the dim light of California's death row at San Quentin State Prison, a man sat with a worn Bible open on his lap. His head was bowed, lips moving silently. Guards and fellow inmates walked past, knowing his name all too well. Charles Chideth Ng. To the outside world, Ng was a sadistic serial killer, convicted of participating in a spree of kidnappings, torture, and murders with his partner Leonard Lake in the mid-1980s. But in the decades since his arrest, Ng has reinvented himself behind bars, portraying himself as a devout Christian seeking redemption. Born December 24, 1960, in Hong Kong, Charles Ng grew up in a wealthy but strict household. His father was a successful businessman who demanded perfection from his son. Ng rebelled, stealing, fighting, and constantly in trouble. At 15, after being expelled from multiple schools, Ng was sent to England for boarding school. There, he lasted only a short time before being expelled again. In 1978, he moved to the United States to attend Notre Dame de Namur University in California. But his time there was cut short after an arrest for stealing from a store. It was around this time that Ng met Leonard Lake, a Vietnam War veteran with apocalyptic survivalist fantasies. The two formed a deadly alliance that would leave a trail of victims across California. Between 1984 and 1985, Lake and Ng lured men, women, and entire families to a remote cabin in Wilseyville, California. There, they carried out kidnappings, sexual assaults, torture, and murders, then documenting some of their crimes on videotape. Lake was obsessed with building a bunker to survive what he believed would be the collapse of society. He also dreamed of creating a sex-slave compound. Ng, younger and impressionable, joined in, participating in horrific acts that would later shock the nation. The killing spree ended when Lake was arrested for firearms violations in 1985. Before he could be tried, Lake swallowed a cyanide capsule, dying instantly. Ng fled to Canada, where he was eventually caught shoplifting in Calgary. Ng's extradition to the United States became a legal battle that dragged on for years. Canada, which opposes the death penalty, resisted sending him back to face capital charges. But in 1991, after assurances of due process, Ng was returned to California. His trial was one of the longest and most expensive in U.S. history, lasting 8 months and costing taxpayers over $20 million. Prosecutors presented evidence linking Ng to 11 murders, including videos showing him assaulting and mocking his victims. In 1999, Ng was convicted on 11 counts of murder and sentenced to death. He was sent to San Quentin's death row, where he would join more than 700 other condemned inmates. Somewhere along the way, Ng began to portray himself as a changed man. Through prison ministry programs, he claimed to have embraced Christianity, studying scripture daily and attending chapel services. To his supporters, few but vocal, Ng's conversion was genuine, a sign that even the most depraved could find forgiveness. To his critics, it was a cynical move to soften his image and possibly gain sympathy and appeals. Ng began corresponding with Christian volunteers, writing about repentance, grace, and the hope of salvation. He occasionally contributed to prison newsletters with religious reflections, painting himself as a man transformed by faith. At San Quentin, Ng lives under 23-hour-a-day lockdown. He spends much of his time reading, writing letters, and studying the Bible. Guards describe him as polite but reserved, rarely discussing his crimes. Despite his religious image, Ng continues to fight his sentence through appeals, none of which have succeeded so far. For the families of his victims, his faith is irrelevant. They see him as a man who has never fully admitted the extent of his crimes. Ng's case raises difficult questions. Can someone who has committed unspeakable acts truly change? Does embracing religion erase the past, or is it simply a way to cope with a lifetime of confinement? For death penalty opponents, Ng's transformation is an argument for life imprisonment instead of execution. For supporters of capital punishment, it is a reminder that some crimes, no matter how remorseful the perpetrator claims to be, deserve the ultimate penalty. Charles Ng remains on death row in California, where executions have been effectively halted for years. Whether he dies by lethal injection, old age, or other means, his name will forever be tied to one of America's most disturbing serial murder cases. In his cell, Ng continues to read his Bible and pray, a man condemned by the law, but claiming salvation in the eyes of God. Number 6. Hyen Su Lim, the pastor who walked into North Korea and almost never returned. It was January 2015. A biting wind swept across the Yalu River as Pastor Hyen Su Lim crossed the border from China into North Korea. For most people, this was a journey you simply did not make, especially as a foreigner, especially as a Christian pastor. But Lim wasn't a tourist. He had been traveling to North Korea for nearly 2 decades, delivering humanitarian aid, food, medicine, clothing to some of the most isolated communities in the world. It was a mission of compassion. At least that's how he saw it. The North Korean government would see it very differently. Hyen Su Lim was no ordinary visitor. Born in South Korea in 1955, he emigrated to Canada in the early 1980s. By 1986, he was the senior pastor at Light Korean Presbyterian Church in Toronto, one of the largest Korean churches in the country. His congregation was vibrant, his reputation respected, and over the years, his church poured millions into humanitarian work. North Korea, cut off from the world, plagued by famine and poverty, became one of his main destinations. Lim visited more than 100 times, overseeing orphanages, soup kitchens, and nursing homes. He never spoke against the government while there. He understood the risks, or so he thought. In early February 2015, Canadian authorities received disturbing news. Pastor Lim had vanished. His family hadn't heard from him. The organization he worked with in North Korea confirmed he'd been detained. What began as a humanitarian trip was now an international crisis. In a country with no diplomatic relations with Canada, every day of silence was dangerous. North Korean state media eventually broke the silence. Pastor Lim, they claimed, was guilty of the most serious crime in the country, attempting to overthrow the state. The regime accused him of using humanitarian aid as a cover to spread Christianity and destabilize the government. They said his sermons abroad were slander against North Korea's leadership. They alleged he had infiltrated the country with a hidden political agenda. In most nations, these charges would be dismissed as unfounded. In North Korea, they could mean only one thing: death. Trials in North Korea aren't like those in the West. There's no jury, no independent press. Instead, in December 2015, Lim appeared in a grand courtroom, surrounded by uniformed guards and cameras from state television. The pastor, wearing a dark suit and a blank expression, was made to read a confession, likely scripted. He admitted to spreading subversive propaganda and helping the US and South Korea to isolate and overthrow the regime. Observers knew what such a public confession meant. Death sentences had been handed down for less. For months, it was unclear whether Pastor Lim would face a firing squad. Then came the announcement. Instead of execution, he would serve life imprisonment with hard labor. This was no mercy. It was a slow-motion death sentence. He was sent to a labor camp where inmates toiled for hours each day, breaking rocks, digging frozen ground, and carrying heavy loads. Food was scarce. Temperatures in winter dropped far below freezing. Later, Lim would recall the toll. "I worked 8 hours a day, 6 days a week. I was the only prisoner there." He lost over 50 pounds. His health deteriorated rapidly. Back in Canada, his family launched an international campaign. Churches rallied in prayer vigils. Human rights organizations called his sentence a violation of international law. Canadian diplomats, without an embassy in Pyongyang, worked through Sweden, which serves as Canada's protecting power in North Korea. The political climate made negotiations even more tense. North Korea was testing missiles. Relations with the West were icy. But behind closed doors, talks continued. In 2017, something changed. North Korean leader Kim Jong-un, looking to ease tensions and perhaps gain diplomatic leverage, agreed to release Pastor Lim on humanitarian grounds. A Canadian delegation flew to Pyongyang. They found him frail, visibly aged, but alive. After more than 2.5 years in captivity, he was escorted to a plane bound for home. When Pastor Lim stepped off the plane in Toronto, his family embraced him through tears. The man who had entered North Korea healthy and full of energy returned thin, slow-moving, but still determined in faith. At a press conference, he did not speak of revenge or bitterness. Instead, he thanked those who had prayed and worked for his freedom. And he vowed to continue helping people in need, though never again by stepping into North Korea. Hyen Su Lim's ordeal remains one of the most high-profile cases of a Christian pastor imprisoned in North Korea. It's a reminder that in some parts of the world, acts of charity can be seen as acts of war, and a Bible in your hand can be considered a weapon against the state. He faced the risk of execution. He endured years of forced labor, and yet he walked out alive, a testament to survival against impossible odds. In North Korea, the difference between life and death can be a single accusation. For Pastor Hyen Su Lim, the cost of his mission was almost everything: his freedom, his health, even his life. But in the end, faith carried him through prison gates and back into the arms of his family. And that was just half the list. From cult evangelists to self-proclaimed prophets, these men remind us that faith can be both a beacon of hope and a dangerous weapon when twisted by human ambition. But the question remains, did all of them truly deserve the ultimate sentence? Or are some still preaching behind bars, believing they've been chosen for a higher purpose? In the next part, we move into the top 5, where the stories only get darker and the stakes even higher.